high-tech projects and highly engineered projects can work really well when you have a lot of infrastructure. Think bridges or houses in the floodplain, and you really can't allow the river to have physical space and the ability to move around um, within that riverscape. Low tech is and process-based restoration is all about creating geomorphic processes. And that inevitably has a degree of variability and uncertainty. The kinds of projects that low tech is trying to target are projects where you can initiate these geomorphic processes and then let the riverscape do the work. So you're feeding this riverscape a ton of woody materials, maybe recreating processes that beavers would have within the landscape, and allowing that riverscape to move and change and be very dynamic within that riverscape. So think about the both biotic and abiotic aspects of that. So there's advantages to both. I think it's a reasonable concern if there's a lot of infrastructure within that system. I think that if you're putting in a lot of woody debris jams immediately upstream of a bridge or a house that's located directly in the floodplain, it can pose some risks. And so I think it's important to just think about where you are within the watershed, what kinds of constraints you have upstream and downstream. There are so many benefits to feeding these systems and adding wood back into our riverscapes that it really just depends on what the primary concerns are. Are you seeing water stick around within the riverscape, or is it drying up by the end of June? Because these kinds of structures can add to keeping that water on the landscape. And so I think if the concern is infrastructure, those are very valid concerns. If the concern is just simply wood within the riverscape, within an area that there's not a lot of immediate infrastructure, there's a lot of benefits to this kind of work that should be seen. In my opinion, and in the research that we've been seeing, they do not. For example, in the Asotin IMW, we have hundreds of structures within that system, and this is a steelhead spawning area, and we are seeing them navigate those structures wonderfully and move up within the system. I think some important things to remember about these structures is that they can help keep water on a landscape. And so thinking about, as droughts happen more commonly within the West, these structures actually can provide more water and keep that water around. And so I think for fish in particular, it's really important that they have water and are able to have access to more habitat. And so if you build one enormous BDA and walk away from the system, I think you could have a fish barrier problem. But if you build multiple tiered ponds within a system and design for the kind of fish that you may have within that system, it really is not an issue. Reconsidering and reimagining what riverscapes can be and taking these systems when folks, particularly European folks, moved into the West, we straightened and channelized a lot of our streams in the West. And there were reasons for that, like irrigation, making room for agriculture, and those made sense. And in some places, they still do make sense to contain watersheds within very certain areas. But we are finding that there are some places that we can allow these riverscapes to return to what they were 200, 300 years ago. And adding wood back into these riverscapes is one way to reinitiate those processes. And so I think the important thing to remember is there are places within our watersheds that we can allow these riverscapes to return to what they were. And it turns out we now know how to do that. And so identifying those places and just moving forward with reinitiating processes and not necessarily micromanaging stream systems, but just reigniting geomorphic processes, creating bars and pools and meanders and side channels, floodplain connection. This kind of work can do that. And it can be really exciting to see that some of the benefits being, water staying on the landscape for longer, more habitat for all sorts of different species. Maybe beaver can move back in, and they're fantastic at engineering riverscapes for ducks and frogs and fish and all sorts of animals. And so I think just thinking about the whole habitat perspective, identifying those areas that we really can let the riverscapes return to what they were a few hundred years ago, um, and letting the riverscapes do the work. It's that really tricky answer, and one that I think natural resources people just love, which is it just depends. It can be within the hour that you put the structure in. I've worked on projects where you build a BDA or a PAL and immediately see sediment as soon as the structure's in, building behind the structure, creating change with an instance. If you build a BDA where you actively do have water, you can change a stream from an incised channel with maybe very minimal access to the floodplain to a fully reconnected floodplain if you're within the right space. So that can happen. On the other hand, you can put structures in and it could take years. If you are building post-assisted log structures, which are just really mimicking woody debris jams, you need stream power and you need floods, and these really active pulses of water to let that riverscape do the work. And so it really depends on where we're working and what kind of structures we're implementing. I think the projects that I really enjoy working on and that our teams see a lot of success in are the projects where we can have multiple phases. And that's really just due to that same principle of just letting the riverscape do the work, and you're feeding it the tools that it needs to be able to create that geomorphic change. And so in a lot of our projects, we've implemented all of these structures that mimic woody debris jams or beaver dams, and they take modification and they take time to work. And so, for example, we may implement a bunch of structures, have a flood pulse, and then go back to that same site and make adjustments and modifications based on what the riverscape is telling us and how it's changing. And so I think, you can see successes and really exciting things happening from one phase of implementation and walking away, but having the ability to come back and see that change and adapt to what that project and riverscape is telling you is really exciting. Perhaps when we're looking at the floodplain, we have these allowable spaces of, maybe it's not one toe of the hill slope to the other and letting the stream move within that entire area. Maybe there's fields we don't want to let go of, and that's okay. And reigniting these geomorphic processes and allowing that stream to move doesn't always have to mean all or nothing. And so I think Couse Creek is a great place to implement more low-tech structures and reignite a lot of those processes, particularly in that there are areas of inset floodplain. There are side channels that we could put BDAs and keep water on the landscape. There's a lot of space that we can utilize and implement these structures, but it doesn't have to mean all or nothing. And so I think that's an important piece for Couse Creek. We can let the riverscape do the work without having it mean that it, takes up that entire valley bottom. So I think that's an important part of LTPPR, particularly in Couse Creek.